Okay, everyone. So, welcome back. So, today I'm going to be sharing with you an update to the user interface that I'm doing with my GDevelop game that I talked about previously called Don't Take the Cakes. All right, so let me just again show you that game I made for the game jam. Um, Again, I made it in GDevelop. And like I said before, one of the big things, or two big things, were that number one, it was not mobile friendly because you can see here that you have to use the mouse and keyboard controls to play the game. Number two, it did not look very good as far as the user interface and whatnot. There were things that were kind of cobbled together. So this was my initial version with for that I submitted for the game jam. And I mentioned that I was starting to work on some of it yesterday. So again, here's the messy start here. I started adding buttons like the start button. Doesn't go with anything, and I know it's above the controls text. It didn't render properly here. So, I got like different buttons that look like they were cobbled together and whatnot. So, yesterday when I was working on the game, I started working on that, um, making things better there. So, like you saw initially, there weren't any on-screen buttons at all. So the big thing that I did was I started looking for button assets that I could use in my game. And I found some in the GDevelop marketplace. So if you're using GDevelop, it's a great resource for finding art and sound for your game without having to make all of it on your own, right? Um, so those buttons that you saw here uh, were buttons that I got from the GDevelop marketplace. All right. So let me start out by admitting that user interface and polish is actually one of my least favorite areas to work on. It's just never really been my strong point, and maybe that's because it's too subjective. So, what I mean by that is that what I think looks good or at least okay might not work for other people. So, I've never been the type of person that really has an eye for that, right? I usually prefer to focus on functionality, like does the thing work or not, you know? And usually that's where a feature that I'm working on has a concrete specification that determines yes or no, does this function work? All right. So for an example, we're talking about buttons, right? So I'm more inclined to worry about does the button actually work and give back the intended result rather than does it look good? And I don't know if that's just me, but that's one of the things that I struggle with when I do my front end web development work. But usually in those jobs, I have like a client or a UI expert or a customer telling me what they want. And usually there's even someone on the team who designs all the buttons and components and the layout specifications and whatnot. Okay. So when I'm explaining this in my process, it's from someone who is trying to do this um, as someone who is by no means an expert and who's working on it solo. You know, now if the games that I work on get good feedback and seem like they would be good for release, then usually I'll go ahead and decide to buy more assets later on, or even hire a designer to really take care of that. But I just want to make that clear that I'm not an expert on look and feel or user interface. And I'm sure that a UI expert or maybe some of the players or people who are viewing this will probably have a lot of criticism about my work on it. But that's okay. I'm definitely open to feedback on color choices, layout, design, and all of that other stuff. Okay. Um, so like I said, the main problem was that none of the buttons I found really fit in with the look and feel of or the color scheme of my game, right? So yeah, so yeah, this is not really that great, right? So um, I had to figure out like how I'm gonna handle that. So my starting point was to really think about um, the color patterns, the color palettes and combinations in the game, right? I wanted to look less cobbled together and more coherent. So the background that I got from Game Art Guppy, uh, again, I'll show you this asset pack again. That was the top-down tower defense bunnies versus badgers set. That was most of the background and whatnot. You see, they've got like a lot of teal, right? That major teal background. So I wanted to think about colors that would work well with teal and that greenish color for the message backgrounds and the buttons. So I did some research on sites like Figma and coolers.co. All right. So if you're ever in the market to become like a UI designer or anything like that, especially Figma is a really good site to know about from a professional point of view. But there's sites that give you tips on color palettes, right? So one of the ones that I saw for on Figma was the seawater aquarium. We got this teal with some light aqua and like blue colors and whatnot, and maybe a bit darker teal. And then there's coolers.co, there's a lot more variety of palettes here that go with teal. And I was kind of looking at um, this one here, which is similar. And you see, it's also got like that cream color, which I think would go well for the text. Okay. Um, so that was one of the first things that I wanted to resolve was a color palette. And I will also say that if you look at the tower defense, there's also like a lot of brown that goes with it too. And you see some of the color palettes also have like this, what is it? There was like a rusty shipwreck, which has some brown in it too. So, I might throw a splash of brown or tan in there somewhere too. But, I expect that maybe some of this will change throughout the development. Okay, so I had a color palette picked out. Another thing I did was I went back to the Game Art Guppy site, and there's a simple aqua UI set that provides like a background and some buttons that have that aqua color, right? So I figured that here's an example of it being used in some games, similar color schemes. They got a little bit more green, but you could see it's flexible, right? So I figured that having art and assets made by the same person might help the game look a little bit more coherent. Okay, that same art, same style. So let me talk about the actual buttons. Okay, so um, usually when you're talking about buttons in a UI, let's see, button UI states. So they have different states that they usually can be, right? Let's see, is this a good? Okay, yeah. So here's an example of a documentation page that talks about like design for buttons. So default is like the button on the page when nothing's touching it, but it's active and not disabled, right? Hovered is like when your mouse or your finger or whatever is hovering over the button. And focused, is when we're not going to worry so much about focus, but the other one really I wanted to focus on was pressed, and that's when your mouse or cursor is actually pressing down. Okay. Um, so when you make your button designs, you usually want to have uh, designs for those, at least those three states, so that you know that you're signify to the user that the button is responding to your interaction, right? So one of the nice things that GDevelop, let me go ahead and share my GDevelop screen here. Um, Give me one second. Let me just switch over here. Um, okay. Yeah, so one of the nice things that GDevelop does here is that it actually allows you to create buttons, right? You can go to add new object, and they have like a button that you could choose, right, for user interface. And if you see here, um, these are just some buttons that I came up with, like a play button, right? It gives you like a label, which is the text that will appear on it, and like the um, different states, idle, which is like default, hovered, and pressed. All right. And you can have different images for each of them, right? So what I did was my plan was to swap out the default buttons that GDevelop gave me with some images, the images from the Game Art Guppy pack. All right. So the Game Art Guppy pack only had like this one button that I used for idle. So in order to make the other, like the hovered and pressed, I just opened up another program called paint.net, which is good for graphic uh, design and whatnot, and just made some quick changes, some really basic changes like changing the brightness and contrast. All right, so you can adjust that here, um, do things like that. And you have a really easy way to take this base button image and modify it for the different states. All right. So for the hover state, I made it a little bit brighter, like it's being highlighted, which you can kind of see here. And then for the pressed state, I made it a little bit darker. All right. So um, that was my plan for actually implementing the change, right? So now you can see that if I do this in if I show you the preview in GDevelop for the start button, and I did also make the text a nice cream color. Now I've got a button that looks more like it fits in with the color scheme, and it has like the different states. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and do that for the other buttons as well. Okay. Another thing that I did in GDevelop to make it stand out a little more, because you see before I actually run it, this is like the level editor. The button doesn't stand out as much. So what I did was I used like the visual effects. I add some beveled edges, which makes it look more like raised and elevated, makes the button look more raised and elevated so it stands out. And I also added like a little outline to it to make it stand out a little bit further. All right. So now I have a button that I think looks better. It's not perfect, but like I said, I expect to make changes to this as I go through based on feedback and further research. Um, it's better, and I'm gonna make these changes to the buttons throughout the game. Okay, so I wanted to share a little bit about that process of, considering how I'm going to fix this UI starting with the buttons. So I think that's all for now. And next time I'll talk more about some of the other changes that I'm going to be making. Okay, great. I hope you enjoyed the video, and please do feel free to leave any comments or questions or comments or concerns or anything like that, and to play the game and leave any feedback if you have any thoughts. All right, thanks.